The small brown puppy darted between Marcus Chen's legs for the third time in less than a minute, nearly tripping him on the crowded downtown sidewalk. The dog wasn't just following. It was herding, pushing, desperate in a way that made the veteran officer's instincts flare even before his mind caught up to the pattern. The animal's ribs showed through matted fur, dirt caked its paws, and its tongue lolled from exhaustion, but it wouldn't stop. Wouldn't eat the protein bar Marcus had crumbled on the pavement, wouldn't come when called. It just kept circling back, barking once, then sprinting ahead 10 yards before stopping to look back with eyes that held something Marcus had seen before. In people who'd run out of options and were betting everything on one last plea for help. Marcus had been a police officer for 11 years, and he'd learned to read body language the way other people read street signs. This puppy wasn't lost. It was on a mission. Every time Marcus slowed down or turned toward his patrol car, the dog would dart back and grab his pant leg, tugging with surprising strength for something so small and starved. Pedestrians gave them both a wide berth, a few filming on their phones, probably thinking they were watching a cute rescue moment unfold. But there was nothing cute about the raw panic in the animal's movements. The way it kept glancing over its shoulder toward the east end of downtown, toward the old warehouse district that had been scheduled for demolition for the past 2 years. "All right, buddy," Marcus said quietly, crouching down to the puppy's level. His knees protested. Too many years of foot patrols and not enough stretching. "Show me." The dog's ears perked up immediately. It took 2 cautious steps forward, then looked back as if checking whether Marcus was serious this time. When the officer stood and gestured ahead, the puppy bolted, weaving through the afternoon crowd with Marcus jogging behind, one hand on his radio, the other resting instinctively near his belt. He didn't know what he was running toward, but 12 years of experience had taught him that when something broke pattern this dramatically, you paid attention. The streets began to empty as they moved away from the commercial district. Storefronts gave way to chain-link fences and cracked parking lots. The puppy never slowed, never hesitated at intersections, just kept moving with the kind of certainty that came from repetition. This wasn't the first time it had made this run. Marcus could see that now in the way the dog navigated, taking shortcuts through gaps in fences, avoiding a broken storm drain that would have been invisible to someone unfamiliar with the route. The animal had memorized this path, practiced it, and that realization made Marcus's pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of keeping up. They crossed into the warehouse district just as the afternoon sun began its slide toward the horizon, throwing long shadows across the empty streets. Most of the buildings here were hollow shells, windows broken or boarded, loading docks chained shut. The city had bought the whole area 3 years ago with plans for redevelopment that never materialized, leaving it in limbo. A perfect place for squatters, drug deals, or worse. Marcus called it in, keeping his voice low and steady as he updated dispatch on his location. Following up on a potential welfare check, warehouse district, 4th and Industrial. No visual on any subjects yet. Maintaining observation. The dispatcher's voice crackled back with concern. "Copy that, Unit 12. Do you need backup?" Marcus watched the puppy stomp in front of a rust-red warehouse, smaller than the others, its loading bay sealed with a padlocked roll door. "Stand by," he replied. Assessing now. The dog was scratching at a side door, whining in a pitch that made Marcus's teeth ache. Not the playful whine of a pet wanting attention. This was distress. Fear. The officer approached slowly, scanning the building's exterior, checking windows, looking for signs of occupation. No fresh tire tracks in the dust. No cigarette butts or trash near the entrance. The building looked as abandoned as everything else on the block. But the puppy was frantic now, spinning in tight circles, barking twice, then pawing at the door hard enough that Marcus could hear the scrape of nails on metal even from 10 feet away. "Police!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the empty lot. "Is anyone inside?" Silence answered him. Even the puppy went still for a moment, as if listening. Then it started again, more desperate, a sound that was half bark and half howl. Marcus tried the door handle. Locked. But the mechanism was old and loose. He could force it if needed. But protocol said wait for backup when entering potentially occupied structures. Protocol said secure the perimeter and call for additional units. Protocol said a lot of things that had kept Marcus alive and employed for over a decade. The puppy looked up at him with eyes that shredded every regulation Marcus had ever memorized. He'd seen that look before, in the faces of witnesses who couldn't speak, in the body language of victims who'd given up on words. The animal was begging. Not for food, not for shelter. For him to understand what it couldn't say. Marcus pulled his flashlight from his belt, tested the door one more time, and made a decision that he knew he'd have to justify in paperwork later. He braced his shoulder against the door and pushed. The old lock gave way with a metallic shriek that echoed through the empty district like a warning bell. Inside, the warehouse was darker than Marcus expected, the boarded windows blocking most of the fading daylight. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of empty shelving units and scattered debris. The air smelled of rust and old concrete and something else, something organic and wrong, that made his hand move to his weapon without conscious thought. The puppy didn't wait for him to adjust to the darkness. It took off running toward the back of the space, nails clicking on the concrete floor, barking in sharp bursts that bounced off the high ceiling and made it impossible to tell exactly where the sound was coming from. Marcus followed, sweeping his light across the interior, checking corners, doorways, any space large enough to hide a threat. "Police!" he called again, louder this time. "If anyone is in here, make yourself known." His voice sounded small in the vast empty space, swallowed by the distance and the dark. The puppy's barking grew more intense, taking on an edge that made Marcus move faster, training overriding the voice in his head that said this was a mistake, that he should have waited, that he was alone in an unsecured location with no backup and no clear understanding of what he was walking into. Then the flashlight beam found the storage container. It sat against the far wall, a metal box about the size of a large closet, the kind used for securing equipment or hazardous materials. The puppy was throwing itself against the container's door, leaving small dents in the thin metal, barking without pause. Marcus approached carefully, listening past the dog's noise for any sound from inside the box. For a moment there was nothing, just his own breathing and the echo of barking and the distant hum of the city beyond these walls. Then he heard it, quiet, barely audible. The sound of someone trying not to make any sound at all. A tiny, terrified breath. A child's whimper, cut short as if the person inside had clapped a hand over their own mouth. Marcus's training took over, his voice shifting into the calm, steady tone he'd perfected over a decade of crisis calls. "It's okay," he said, kneeling beside the container, one hand on the puppy's head to quiet it. "My name is Officer Chen. I'm with the police. You're safe now. I'm going to get you out." The lock on the storage container was a simple padlock, industrial but old, the kind that could be cut with bolt cutters or shot off in an emergency. Marcus didn't have bolt cutters. He had his service weapon, his flashlight, and a puppy that had finally gone quiet, sitting at his feet with its whole body trembling. The officer made a decision born from years of field experience, and the sound of that tiny, terrified breath still echoing in his ears. He stood, took 3 steps back, and called dispatch again. "This is Unit 12. I need immediate backup at my location, 4th and Industrial, inside the red warehouse south side. I have a potential juvenile victim. Locked container. Requesting paramedics and additional units. Urgent. The dispatcher's response was immediate. Professional urgency replacing routine acknowledgement. Copy that, Unit 12. Backup and paramedics en route. ETA 6 minutes. Do you have visual on the victim? Negative, Marcus said, moving back toward the container. Audio contact only. Victim is contained in a locked storage unit. I'm going to attempt to make verbal contact and assess condition. He knelt again, this time pressing his ear close to the metal surface. The container was cold against his skin. Too cold for someone to have been inside for very long without suffering exposure. Can you hear me? He asked, keeping his voice gentle. I'm a police officer. I'm right outside. Can you tell me your name? Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. 4. Then a small voice, scratchy and weak, barely more than a whisper. Emma. The word came out broken, like it hurt to speak. My name is Emma. Marcus felt something tight, release in his chest, even as a dozen new fears crowded in to replace it. She was conscious. Verbal. Those were good signs. But the weakness in her voice, the rasp that suggested dehydration or worse, those were warnings he couldn't ignore. Emma, that's a beautiful name, he said, keeping his tone steady even as his mind raced through the possibilities of what he was dealing with. I'm Officer Chen, but you can call me Marcus. How long have you been in there, sweetheart? Another pause, longer this time. When Emma spoke again, her voice wavered like she was crying or trying not to. I don't know. Days, I think. It's dark. I can't see anything. The last words dissolved into a sob that she tried to muffle. Is Shadow okay? The puppy. Did he find help? I told him to run. I told him to find someone. The puppy at Marcus's feet let out a soft whine, pressing against the container door, as if trying to push through the metal by will alone. Marcus reached down and stroked its head, understanding now what he'd witnessed on those downtown streets. This animal hadn't been lost. It had been sent. Shadow is right here with me, Marcus said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't have time to process. He's the one who brought me to you. He's a very brave dog, Emma. You both are. He could hear her crying now, the sound muffled but unmistakable, relief and fear and exhaustion all pouring out at once. Marcus straightened, examining the padlock more carefully with his flashlight. It was secured through a hasp that looked newer than the container itself. Recent addition, installed with fresh screws. Someone had put this lock here deliberately. Someone had put Emma inside and meant for her to stay there. The realization sent a cold spike of anger through Marcus's professional calm. This wasn't a hiding spot. It wasn't an accident. This was imprisonment. Emma, listen to me carefully, Marcus said, moving back to the door, speaking clearly so she could hear every word. I'm going to get you out of there very soon. I have more officers and paramedics on the way right now. But I need you to tell me if you're hurt anywhere. Can you move your arms and legs? My ankle hurts, Emma replied, her voice steadier now that she knew help had arrived. I think I twisted it trying to get out, and I'm really thirsty. I haven't had water since yesterday. There was a bottle, but it's empty now. Marcus's jaw tightened. Dehydration, possible injury, unknown duration of captivity. Each detail added urgency to a situation that was already critical. Okay, sweetheart, we're going to take care of all of that. The paramedics will be here in just a few minutes. Can you tell me, do you know how you got here? Do you remember what happened? The silence that followed was different this time. Heavier. When Emma spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely a whisper, as if saying the words too loudly might make them real all over again. "I was walking home from school." A van stopped, and a man asked if I'd seen his lost dog. He had a picture and everything. When I came closer to look, someone grabbed me from behind. They put something over my mouth, and everything went fuzzy, and when I woke up, I was here. Her breath hitched. There were other people, too. Other kids. They took them away in a different van yesterday. They said they were coming back for me today. Marcus's blood went cold. Other kids. Taken away. Coming back. The pieces were arranging themselves into a picture he recognized from training seminars and federal bulletins. A picture that turned this from a rescue into something much bigger and darker. He keyed his radio again, keeping his voice low and controlled even as adrenaline flooded his system. "Dispatch, Unit 12. Update your alert. Potential multiple victims, possible trafficking situation. I need detective units and federal liaison contacted immediately. Suspect return possible, requesting additional units for perimeter security." The dispatcher's voice came back tight and professional. All routine gone now. "Copy that, Unit 12. Escalating response. Additional units 2 minutes out. Detective supervisor has been notified." Marcus could hear sirens now. Faint but growing closer, the cavalry arriving, just like protocol promised they would. But 2 minutes felt like an eternity when a child was locked in a metal box and traffickers might return at any moment. He examined the container door again, looking for any weakness, any way to get Emma out before backup arrived. The hinges were on the inside. No access there. The lock was solid despite its age. Forcing the door would require tools or controlled force he couldn't safely apply without risking injury to Emma if she was pressed against the interior. "Emma," he said, making his decision, "I want you to move to the back of the container, as far from the door as you can get. Can you do that for me?" He heard shuffling, a small gasp of pain, then Emma's voice from farther away. "Okay, I'm back." Marcus drew his service weapon, angled the barrel away from the door's center mass and toward the lock mechanism, and fired once. The shot was deafening in the enclosed warehouse space, the report bouncing off metal and concrete until it sounded like a dozen weapons had discharged. The padlock shattered, pieces of metal spinning away as the hasp swung free. Marcus immediately holstered his weapon and pulled the container door open, his flashlight beam flooding the interior. Emma was pressed against the back wall, small and thin in dirty clothes. Dark hair matted around a face that was too pale, eyes too large, one ankle bent at an angle that made Marcus's trained eye register immediate concern. But she was alive, conscious, looking at him with an expression that shifted from terror to hope in the span of a single breath. Shadow pushed past Marcus's legs and launched himself into the container, going straight to Emma with a series of whines and yelps that sounded almost human in their relief. The little girl wrapped her arms around the puppy and finally, completely, broke down. Marcus moved forward slowly, letting her cry, giving Shadow a moment to do what he'd crossed half the city to accomplish. "You're safe now," Marcus said quietly. "I promise, you're safe." Marcus had just finished calling in paramedics when the sound reached him, faint at first, almost lost beneath the approaching sirens and Emma's quiet sobs. Footsteps. Multiple sets, moving fast across concrete somewhere deeper in the warehouse complex. His hand went to his weapon as Shadow's head snapped up, ears forward, a low growl building in the puppy's throat that made every hair on Marcus's neck stand on end. The dog had gone from relief to alert in less than a second, his small body tense between Emma and the open warehouse space beyond the container. "Stay here," Marcus whispered to Emma, already moving toward the sound. Don't make any noise." He clicked off his flashlight and let his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the boarded windows, his service weapon drawn but held low as he moved along the wall toward what looked like a connecting passage to an adjacent building. The footsteps had stopped, but he could hear voices now, muffled and urgent, coming from somewhere beyond the doorway. His radio crackled, and he silenced it immediately, not wanting to give away his position before he understood what he was dealing with. The connecting passage was short and led to a larger warehouse space that had clearly been in use recently. Marcus took in the scene with the quick, cataloging awareness that came from years of processing crime scenes. Rows of folding tables covered with documents and what looked like identity cards. Stacks of duffel bags lined against one wall. A van parked near a loading dock with its back doors open, revealing blankets and plastic water bottles scattered across the cargo area. And people, 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in civilian clothes, all moving with the kind of purposeful hurry that came from a plan going wrong. One of the men was speaking rapid Spanish into a cell phone, his free hand gesturing sharply at the others. Marcus caught enough words to understand they were talking about moving up their timeline, about cutting losses, about a pickup that was supposed to happen tomorrow but needed to happen now. Another man was loading the duffel bags into the van while the woman gathered documents from the tables, shoving them into a briefcase with shaking hands that betrayed her fear, even from across the warehouse floor. Marcus's mind raced through his options. He was alone, outnumbered, with backup still at least a minute out, and a frightened child depending on him in the next room. Protocol said observe and wait for support. Protocol said don't engage multiple suspects without adequate backup. But the bags being loaded into that van, the documents being destroyed, the cell phone conversation about moving up the timeline. If he waited, evidence would disappear. And if there were more victims, more children somewhere in this operation, waiting meant losing his chance to find them. He keyed his radio to the emergency channel, whispering coordinates and situation details in the clipped shorthand of officer needs assistance calls. Then he stepped into the doorway, weapon raised, voice carrying across the warehouse with the command presence he'd spent years perfecting. "Police! Everyone on the ground! Hands where I can see them now!" For one frozen second, nobody moved. The man with the phone turned toward Marcus with an expression of pure shock. The woman dropped her briefcase, papers scattering across the concrete. Then everything happened at once. The man at the van dropped the duffel bag he'd been holding and ran for a side exit. The woman screamed and dove behind the tables. The man with the phone shouted something in Spanish and reached for his waistband, and Marcus made the split-second assessment that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. "Gun! Drop it!" Marcus's weapon tracked the movement, his finger taking up slack on the trigger. Every muscle in his body coiled for the decision he hoped he wouldn't have to make. The man froze, hand hovering near his belt, eyes locked on Marcus with the cold calculation of someone weighing odds and consequences. Behind Marcus, somewhere in the connecting passage, Shadow was barking with a ferocity that made him sound 3 times his actual size, the sound echoing through both warehouse spaces and adding to the chaos. Sirens filled the air outside now, close enough that Marcus could differentiate individual vehicles. Backup was seconds away. The man with the phone must have heard them too because his hand slowly moved away from his waistband, rising into the air in a gesture of surrender that looked more like defeat than cooperation. "On the ground," Marcus repeated, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "All of you, on the ground, hands behind your heads." The warehouse's main entrance exploded inward as 3 patrol units arrived simultaneously, officers pouring through with weapons drawn and voices overlapping in a controlled storm of commands and confirmations. Marcus didn't lower his weapon until 2 officers had the phone man secured, and a third was handcuffing the woman who tried to hide behind the tables. The fourth suspect, the runner, was being dragged back inside by two more officers who'd intercepted him at the side exit. Within 90 seconds, the scene went from standoff to secure, professional chaos replacing criminal panic as Marcus finally allowed himself to breathe. Victim in the next room, he told the first detective who reached him, a senior investigator named Sarah Rodriguez, who Marcus had worked with on domestic calls before. 8-year-old girl, locked in a storage container, dehydrated and possible ankle injury. Paramedics are with her now. He could hear voices from the connecting passage, medical personnel talking in the calm, reassuring tones they used with frightened children. But, detective, she said there were others. Other kids, taken away yesterday in a different van. Rodriguez's expression hardened. She turned to survey the warehouse space, taking in the tables covered with documents, the duffel bags, the van with its suspicious cargo area. "Show me everything you saw," she said, pulling out her phone to photograph the scene. Every detail. The next 2 hours blurred into a controlled frenzy of investigation and documentation. Federal agents arrived within 30 minutes, trafficking task force specialists who moved through the warehouse with grim efficiency. The documents on the tables turned out to be forged identity papers, passports, and birth certificates for dozens of children, with faces that made Marcus's stomach turn. The duffel bags contained cash, burner phones, and more falsified documents. The van's GPS history revealed routes to 3 other cities and 2 border crossings. What had started as one officer following a desperate puppy had cracked open an operation that had been running for at least 18 months, moving stolen children through a network that spanned 3 states. In a locked office Marcus hadn't even noticed during his initial sweep, they found 7 more children. 3 boys and 4 girls, ages ranging from 6 to 12, locked in a windowless room with a single bathroom and boxes of granola bars stacked against the wall. All of them were frightened, dirty and traumatized, but alive. Paramedics treated them with gentle efficiency, while victim advocates arrived to begin the long process of identification and family reunification. Marcus watched from the doorway as the children were led out to waiting ambulances, each one wrapped in a blanket despite the warm evening air, each one looking around with the dazed expression of someone who couldn't quite believe their nightmare was ending. Shadow stayed with Emma the entire time, even riding in the ambulance when paramedics finally convinced her it was safe to go to the hospital. The puppy sat on the stretcher beside her, his small body pressed against her. Inside, his presence doing more to calm her than any medication or reassurance the adults could offer. Marcus followed in his patrol car, needing to see this through, needing to know the girl who'd survived on nothing but hope and the loyalty of a dog who refused to give up. At the hospital, as doctors examined Emma and started IV fluids to combat her dehydration, a nurse approached Marcus with a tablet showing intake records. "The girl keeps asking about the dog's owner," the nurse said quietly. "She says the puppy belonged to one of the other children who was taken, a boy named David. She's worried about him." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. He thought about Shadow's determination, the way the puppy had memorized that route through the city, the desperate mission that had driven him to find help. "Show me the photos from the warehouse office," he told Rodriguez, who'd arrived at the hospital to take Emma's initial statement. "The children who were recovered. Show me the boys." Rodriguez pulled up the images on her phone, swiping through faces until Marcus stopped her. "That one," he said, pointing to a thin boy with dark hair and scared eyes, maybe 10 years old, sitting wrapped in a blanket with a paramedic's arm around his shoulders. "What's his name?" Rodriguez checked her notes. "David Reyes, age 9, reported missing from a suburb 40 miles north, 3 weeks ago." She looked at Marcus, understanding dawning in her expression. "You think the dog was his?" Marcus didn't answer with words. He simply walked back to Emma's treatment bay, where Shadow was still on guard beside her bed, and showed the girl the photo. Her reaction was immediate. A gasp of recognition followed by tears of relief. "That's him," she whispered. "That's David. He trained Shadow since the dog was really little. When the men came to move us, David made Shadow run away, told him to find help, to bring someone back. We didn't think," her voice broke, "we didn't think it would actually work." An hour later, when David's parents arrived at the hospital in a state of frantic joy and disbelief, Marcus was there to witness the reunion. The boys saw Shadow first, and the sound he made, half cry, half laugh, entirely overwhelmed, cut through every professional barrier Marcus had ever built. David dropped to his knees and Shadow launched himself into the boy's arms, the two of them tangling together on the hospital floor, while David's parents sobbed, and Emma smiled from her bed, and Marcus had to turn away to wipe his own eyes before anyone could see. The hospital room where David recovered over the next 2 days became an unexpected gathering place for people who'd never met, but were bound together by the thin thread of one puppy's impossible determination. Marcus found himself returning between shifts, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, a need to see the story through to its end, or maybe just to remind himself why he'd become an officer in the first place. The cynicism that came with 11 years of seeing the worst of humanity had been cracking since the moment he'd opened that storage container, and now, watching David teach Shadow tricks in a hospital bed while his mother cried happy tears in the corner, Marcus felt something in his chest that had been locked away for years finally begin to loosen. Emma was released after 48 hours of observation and IV fluids, her twisted ankle wrapped, and her parents holding her between them like they'd never let go again. Before she left, she visited David's room one last time, the two children sharing a long look that held more understanding than words could carry. They'd been through something together that no one else could fully comprehend, and Shadow had been the bridge between their nightmare and their salvation. Emma knelt carefully, mindful of her injured ankle, and pressed her forehead against Shadow's, whispering something Marcus couldn't hear. The puppy licked her face once, gentle and deliberate, and Emma's mother had to help her stand because she was crying too hard to manage it alone. The task force investigation expanded in ways that surprised even the federal agents who'd seen dozens of trafficking cases. The network the warehouse operation connected to stretched across 5 states and into Mexico, a sophisticated system that had been moving children for nearly 2 years. The 4 suspects Marcus had caught became 7, then 12, then 23, as investigators followed digital trails and financial records. Every arrest led to more questions, more victims identified, more families receiving calls they'd stopped believing they'd ever get. Rodriguez told Marcus during one of his hospital visits that the case would likely result in the largest trafficking prosecution the district had seen in a decade. And it had all started because one puppy refused to give up. "You know what the federal coordinator told me?" Rodriguez said, leaning against the wall outside David's room where they could talk without disturbing the family inside. She said in most trafficking cases, victims are recovered through months of investigation, surveillance, digital forensics, complex operations that take enormous resources and even then don't always succeed. "We got 8 victims back and dismantled an interstate operation because you followed a dog." She shook her head, something like wonder in her expression. "That's not how this usually works." Marcus thought about that as he drove home that evening, the sunset painting the city in shades of amber and rose. Nothing about the past 3 days had followed the usual patterns. Not his decision to chase a stray puppy through downtown streets. Not his choice to enter that warehouse alone. Not the cascade of consequences that had followed from one act of trust. His training had taught him to rely on procedure, on backup, on established protocols that kept officers alive in cases prosecutable. But sometimes the most important calls couldn't be made from a manual. Sometimes you had to trust something deeper than training. The instinct that came from years of reading body language and understanding desperation in all its forms. The following week, when David was finally cleared to go home, the hospital organized a small gathering before his discharge. The doctors and nurses who'd treated him wanted to say goodbye, and somehow word had spread enough that the room filled with people. Emma and her family, 3 of the other recovered children and their parents, Rodriguez and 2 other detectives from the task force, even the paramedics who'd been first on scene at the warehouse. Someone had brought a cake that nobody ate because everyone was crying too much, the kind of tears that came from overwhelming relief and gratitude, and the knowledge that things could have ended so differently. David's father, a quiet man who'd barely spoken during the hospital stay, approached Marcus with Shadow tucked under one arm. "Officer Chen," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "I don't have words for what you did. What Shadow did. My son." He paused, swallowing hard. "We thought we'd lost him forever. 3 weeks of not knowing, of every phone call being a potential nightmare, of seeing his face on missing posters and wondering if we'd ever see it anywhere else. And then we get the call that he's safe, that everyone's safe, because you listened when our dog asked for help." Marcus wanted to deflect, to say he'd just been doing his job. But the weight of the man's gratitude deserved more honesty than professional modesty. "Shadow did the hard part," he said quietly. "I just followed where he led." David's mother stepped forward, her hand resting on her husband's shoulder. "The social worker told us what David did, how he trained Shadow to run, to find help, how he made him leave even though David knew he'd be alone after." Her voice broke. "He's 9 years old, and he was that brave. And Shadow remembered every command, every lesson, found his way across a city he'd never seen before, and wouldn't stop until someone listened." She looked down at the puppy, who was watching the room with alert eyes as if still on guard duty. "We talked about it, my husband and I, about what happens next." Marcus waited, something in their tone suggesting this was more than small talk. David's father shifted Shadow in his arms, then held the puppy out toward Marcus. "We want you to have him," he said, "to keep him. As our way of saying thank you, and because David thinks Shadow earned a job." The boy's been talking non-stop about how Shadow's a hero, how he belongs with other heroes, how he should get to help more people. The man's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. "We'll miss him. God knows we'll miss him. But David's right. Shadow saved a lot of lives doing what he was trained to do. He deserves the chance to keep doing it." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He looked at Shadow, who cocked his head as if considering the proposal himself, then at David, who was sitting up in his hospital bed, watching with an expression that held both sadness and pride. "You're sure?" Marcus asked, directing the question at the boy. "He's your dog, your partner, what you two went through together." David nodded slowly, carefully, like he was still working through his own feelings about the decision. "Shadow knows how to help people now," the boy said, his voice quiet but steady. "He's really good at it. And I think he'd be sad if he had to stop." He paused, then added with the simple wisdom of someone who'd learned hard truths too young. "Sometimes the best way to love someone is to let them do what they're meant to do." The station captain approved Shadow's adoption as the department's first official canine companion 3 days later, after what Marcus suspected was more bureaucratic wrangling than anyone wanted to admit. The puppy was too small and too young for formal police work, but his story had spread through the department and the media with the kind of momentum that made saying no politically impossible. They held a small ceremony in the station break room, complete with a custom vest that had to be taken in 4 inches to fit Shadow's small frame, and a badge that hung crooked no matter how many times Marcus adjusted it. Rodriguez took a photo of Marcus kneeling beside Shadow, both of them looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention, and later that image would appear in newspapers and websites alongside articles about the trafficking case and the unlikely hero who'd broken it open. But in the moment, Marcus was just thinking about how strange it felt to be responsible for this small life that had somehow upended everything he thought he understood about police work and instinct, and the invisible threads that connected protection to purpose. That evening, after the ceremony and the paperwork and the interviews with reporters who wanted to turn tragedy into inspiration, Marcus sat on his apartment floor with Shadow curled against his leg. The puppy was finally showing signs of the trauma he'd been through, sleeping fitfully, startling at sudden sounds, pressing close to Marcus whenever they were in new spaces. But he was also eating steadily, putting on weight, the ribs that had shown so starkly that first day gradually disappearing beneath healthy muscle and glossy fur. He was going to be okay. They both were. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from David. A photo of the boy at home, smiling in his own bed with his arm around a new puppy his parents had surprised him with that afternoon. The message underneath read simply, "Tell Shadow thank you. For everything." Marcus showed the photo to Shadow, who sniffed the screen with interest, tail wagging slowly. "You did good, partner," Marcus said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Better than good. You saved him, saved all of them." Shadow looked up at him with dark eyes that held more intelligence than Marcus had given him credit for during those first frantic minutes downtown. The puppy seemed to understand, in whatever way dogs understood such things, that the mission was complete, that the children were safe, that the desperate run through city streets and the refusal to give up had mattered in ways that would ripple forward through dozens of lives. Marcus felt something shift in his own chest, the cynicism and exhaustion that had been building for years finally releasing their grip. If a half-starved puppy could cross a city alone and refuse to quit until someone listened, then maybe there was more hope left in this work than Marcus had let himself believe. The following months proved Shadow's presence at the station was more than ceremonial. The puppy had a talent for reading people that Marcus came to rely on during wellness checks and victim interviews. Children who wouldn't talk to officers would open up while petting Shadow. Domestic violence victims found courage to leave dangerous situations while a small dog sat quietly at their feet. Shadow couldn't track suspects or detect drugs, but he could do something equally valuable. He could remind people that help existed, that someone cared enough to listen, that even the smallest voice could make a difference if you refused to give up. Marcus watched Shadow work with the same wonder he'd felt that first day, following the puppy through downtown streets without knowing where they were going or why. Trust, it turned out, was a currency that worked both ways. Shadow had trusted Marcus to understand his desperate plea for help. And now Marcus trusted Shadow to know things that procedure and training couldn't teach, to sense fear and trauma and the invisible barriers that kept people from asking for what they needed. Together they became something neither could have been alone. A partnership built not on commands and obedience, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. On the 6-month anniversary of Emma's rescue, Marcus received an invitation to a gathering at David's house, a thank-you barbecue for everyone who'd been part of the investigation and recovery. He brought Shadow, who bounded through the backyard greeting children and adults with equal enthusiasm, his vest identifying him as official but his behavior pure puppy joy. David spent most of the afternoon with Shadow, teaching the dog new tricks and telling anyone who'd listen about the 3 weeks they'd spent together in captivity, about the plan they'd made, about the moment David had pushed Shadow through a gap in a warehouse window and told him to run and not look back. "I knew he'd do it," David told Marcus while they watched Shadow play with Emma and the other kids. "Shadow always does what he's supposed to do. He's reliable like that." The word choice made Marcus smile. Reliable was exactly what Shadow had proven to be, even when the task seemed impossible and the odds were overwhelming. Emma joined them a moment later, walking without her brace now. fully healed except for scars nobody could see. She looked at Shadow, then at Marcus, then said something that would stay with the officer long after the party ended. "My mom says miracles are just when someone brave refuses to give up," Emma said quietly. "I think Shadow's a miracle. And so are you." Marcus drove home that evening with Shadow asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted from playing and attention, and the simple joy of being surrounded by the people he'd saved. The city lights flickered past the windows, the same streets Marcus had patrolled for 11 years now, somehow different, filled with possibility instead of just problems, hope instead of just harm. One puppy had changed everything, not because he was trained or talented or special in any traditional way, but because he'd understood something fundamental that Marcus had almost forgotten: that every life mattered, that giving up was never the answer, that sometimes the most important thing you could do was refuse to stop asking for help until someone finally listened. Shadow shifted in his sleep, paws twitching with dreams Marcus couldn't interpret. Chasing memories, maybe. Or just running through imaginary streets with the same determination that had saved 8 children and restored one officer's faith in the work he'd chosen. Marcus reached over and rested his hand on Shadow's side, feeling the steady rhythm of breathing, the warmth of life and purpose. "Thank you," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the dog or to whatever force had brought them together that day downtown. "For not giving up, for showing me how." Shadow's tail wagged once in sleep, a simple acknowledgement that needed no words. They drove on through the city night, partners now in every way that mattered, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring.